The air hung heavy and still, thick with the scent of damp earth and of ancient pines, as if the very forest itself held its breath. Deep within the unexplored vastness of the American wilderness, a discovery lay waiting, shrouded in the silence of centuries. It wasn't gold, nor a lost civilization, but something far more profound, something that would tear at the very fabric of accepted human history. Scattered amidst a clandestine excavation site, barely visible beneath a thin layer of loam and moss, were bone fragments unlike anything ever catalogued. They were undeniably skeletal, unequivocally ancient, yet their sheer scale and peculiar anatomical structure defied every known primate, every recorded hominid. Each shard spoke of immense power, of a creature that walked upright, commanded a formidable presence, and possessed an evolutionary trajectory that had, until this moment, remained utterly invisible to science. The fossilized remains whispered of a being that was large, immensely strong, and distinctly, terrifyingly, not human. Miles away, in the quiet, rain-kissed university town, nestled among the verdant hills of the Pacific Northwest, Dr. Eris Thorne lived a life defined by intellectual pursuit and a profound, often unsettling solitude. He was a paleoanthropologist of formidable intellect, his mind a labyrinth of unconventional theories and challenging hypotheses that frequently ruffled the feathers of his more conventional peers. Renowned, yes, but equally controversial, Eris had carved a niche for himself on the fringes of mainstream academia, a space where his heterodox ideas about human evolution could breathe without being immediately suffocated by dogma. His small, cluttered office, overflowing with dusty tomes, fossil casts, and maps annotated with archaic scripts, was his sanctuary, a testament to a life spent chasing ghosts of the past. He preferred the company of long-dead ancestors to the often petty politics of the living, finding solace in the silent narratives etched into bone and stone. His days typically followed a predictable rhythm: early morning coffee, hours immersed in research papers or the painstaking analysis of geological samples, interspersed with the occasional, often spirited, debate with a bewildered graduate student. But that Tuesday morning, the familiar cadence of his existence was abruptly shattered. A nondescript package, heavy and sealed with an almost aggressive anonymity, arrived on his doorstep. There was no return address, no sender's name, just his own name, scrawled across the brown paper, in an elegant yet clearly disguised hand. A flicker of unease, a rare sensation for the usually unflappable Eris, stirred within him. Most unsolicited mail was either from an overzealous publisher or a disgruntled colleague. This felt different. Inside, nestled among layers of protective foam, lay not a book or a journal, but an envelope. His fingers, usually so steady when extracting a fragile artifact, trembled slightly as he tore it open. What spilled out onto his desk were not research notes, but a series of high-resolution photographs. Eris picked up the first one, his brow furrowing in a mixture of confusion and growing fascination. The image depicted what appeared to be a femur, snapped cleanly in half, yet its dimensions dwarfed any hominid femur he had ever encountered. Easily twice the thickness, with muscle attachment points suggesting an unbelievable power. Subsequent photos revealed cranial fragments, a partial mandible with teeth of crushing force, and sections of a massive vertebral column. Each image was meticulously shot, showing scale markers, comparative anatomical views, and close-ups revealing unique cellular structures. His initial skepticism, a deeply ingrained professional reflex, was immediate. Hoax, he thought, an elaborate, well-funded prank. But as he scrutinized the images, turning them over and examining the minute details, A chilling realization began to set in. The anatomical structures, while gargantuan, possessed an undeniable organic consistency. The fractures, the weathering patterns, the subtle fossilization indications, these were not fakes. This was real and utterly impossible. Then, he found the letter, tucked beneath the last photograph. It was typed, without a signature, but its words resonated with an urgent, almost desperate plea. "Dr. Thorne," it began, "I have followed your work for years. Your willingness to challenge the accepted narratives makes you uniquely suited, perhaps uniquely alone, in understanding the gravity of what I am about to share. The enclosed photographs represent a discovery that will rewrite every page of human history, every line of evolutionary theory. These are not the remains of a giant ape nor a previously unknown hominid. They are something beyond, something that has been deliberately hidden. I cannot disclose my identity yet, for my life, and frankly yours, would be in immediate peril. Study these. Understand their impossibility. If you are intrigued, if your scientific curiosity outweighs your caution, await further instructions. The truth awaits, Dr. Thorne, but it comes with a terrible price." Eris reread the letter, his mind racing through possibilities, each more fantastical than the last. Deliberately hidden? A terrible price? He scoffed, yet a cold knot formed in his stomach. The photographs, however, were undeniable. They screamed of an anomaly so profound, it threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew. This was not just a new species. This was a paradigm shift, waiting to happen. The implications were staggering, terrifying. He stood up, pacing his cluttered office, the weight of the mysterious package now pressing down on him. His solitary life, once a quiet refuge, suddenly felt exposed, teetering on the precipice of something vast and unknown. But before we delve into Dr. Thorne's perilous journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community of truth seekers. Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose life had been a meticulously constructed edifice of data and peer-reviewed certainty, found himself staring at the photographs as if they were a trick of his own fatigued mind. The images, stark and unforgiving, depicted bone fragments that defied every known anatomical principle for primates, let alone hominids. His initial skepticism, a default setting for any seasoned scientist encountering extraordinary claims, began to fray at the edges, replaced by a much more dangerous emotion, intellectual intrigue. He traced the impossible curvature of what appeared to be a femur, its robust density and unusual articulations suggesting a creature of immense strength, yet entirely outside the established evolutionary tree. The cranial fragments, particularly, hinted at a brain volume that was both significant and disturbingly different from anything cataloged in human or primate anthropology. This wasn't just a variant. It was a fundamental departure. His professional curiosity, a powerful current that had steered his entire career, now surged, overriding the ingrained caution of decades. The anonymous sender's letter, tucked neatly within the package, had been equally unsettling. It wasn't just a request for analysis. It was an insistence on absolute secrecy, a non-negotiable demand that heightened the sense of foreboding. The proposed meeting, described only as culminating in a journey to a secluded cabin deep in the wilderness, painted a picture that was less scientific expedition and more thriller novel. Thorne, a man of laboratories and lecture halls, felt a prickle of unease. This wasn't his usual milieu. The insistence on such extreme measures immediately raised red flags, yet it also underscored the profound nature of the alleged discovery. Why the paranoia? Why the secrecy? These questions gnawed at him, planting seeds of doubt and danger in his mind. He was being drawn into a clandestine world, a stark contrast to the transparent, evidence-based domain he inhabited. This immediate sense of paranoia and inherent danger was perhaps the most potent antagonist, a psychological barrier as formidable as any physical threat. Despite the sender's plea for utmost discretion, Eris knew he couldn't proceed purely on blind faith. His scientific integrity, the bedrock of his reputation, demanded some form of preliminary verification. He began subtly, using his vast academic network not to reveal the full extent of the photos, but to test hypotheses against specific features. He queried colleagues about unusual bone pathologies, obscure primate anatomies, or hypothetical evolutionary paths that might lead to such structures. He crafted his questions with precision, careful not to give away the true source or nature of his inquiry. The responses were uniformly perplexed. One venerated primatologist, after reviewing a carefully cropped image of a potential joint, simply stated, "Eris, if this is real, it rewrites the textbooks, but it's impossible. What are you looking at?" The resistance he encountered went beyond mere academic bewilderment. There were subtle threats, almost imperceptible at first, that began to coalesce. A perfectly secured digital file containing some of his preliminary notes became inexplicably corrupted. An anonymous email, its source untraceable, contained a vague warning about unearthing things best left buried. A grant application he was working on, previously deemed a sure thing, suddenly hit bureaucratic snags, and the project lid, a longtime associate, seemed unusually evasive. It was as if an unknown entity, a shadow organization perhaps, was aware of his nascent investigation, subtly pushing back, guarding a secret. The carefully constructed layers of his academic life, usually so insulated, now felt porous, vulnerable. He realized this wasn't just about a discovery. It was about something far larger, something powerful enough to exert pressure from unseen corners. This unseen adversary was an insidious force, far more intimidating than a direct threat. It was the chilling sensation of being watched, analyzed, and subtly manipulated. He found himself double-checking locks, scrutinizing unfamiliar cars parked near his home, and becoming hyper-aware of his surroundings. This heightened state of vigilance was an unwelcome companion, distracting him from the pure scientific pursuit he craved. The anonymous sender, by insisting on secrecy, had inadvertently cast Eris into a world where knowledge wasn't freely shared, but fiercely protected, often with unseen consequences. This wasn't just a scientific dilemma. It was becoming a dangerous game of cat and mouse, with Eris unsure if he was the hunter or the hunted. His initial curiosity had metamorphosed into a dangerous obsession, a burning need to understand what secret was so monumental, so disruptive, that it warranted such elaborate precautions and veiled threats. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the photographs were merely the tip of an iceberg, and the path to its full revelation was fraught with peril he could barely yet comprehend. The journey into the wilderness was no longer a matter of choice. It had become an imperative. The journey into the forgotten corners of the American wilderness felt less like an expedition and more like a descent into a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Dr. Eris Thorne, usually so grounded in the tangible world of academia, found himself increasingly untethered from reality with each passing mile. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to treacherous dirt tracks carved precariously into the mountainside. The towering pines, thick and ancient, seemed to lean in, whispering secrets only the wind understood. As his battered SUV chewed through the unforgiving terrain, A subtle unease began to prickle at the back of his neck. It wasn't merely the isolation, it was something far more primal. He had GPS coordinates, carefully transcribed from the cryptic letter, leading him deeper into a region so remote it barely registered on modern maps. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. He tried to rationalize the growing anxiety, attributing it to fatigue and the inherent dangers of solo travel in uncharted territory. Yet the rational explanations felt thin, inadequate. There were sounds that weren't quite right, a distant, guttural cry that echoed through the valleys, seemingly too large for any known animal. Then came the fleeting shadows, quick and indistinct, dancing at the periphery of his vision in the dense undergrowth. Were they deer, bears, or something else entirely? Something his mind refused to acknowledge? He found himself constantly checking his rearview mirror. A gnawing sensation that he was being observed followed. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the dense foliage, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. The wilderness, usually a source of scientific wonder, now felt charged with an almost malevolent presence. He reminded himself that he was a man of science. Not superstition, but the conviction wavered with each passing minute. Finally, as dusk painted the sky in hues of deep violet and bruised orange, the coordinates led him to a small, dilapidated cabin, nestled precariously on a rocky outcrop, overlooking a vast, silent valley. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, a surprising sign of life amidst the desolation. He cut the engine, plunging the immediate vicinity into an oppressive silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic pounding of his own heart. For a long moment, he simply sat there, gripping the steering wheel, gathering his courage. This was it. The culmination of weeks of unsettling emails, veiled threats, and growing paranoia. He exited the vehicle, the crunch of gravel under his boots sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. As he approached the cabin, the wooden door creaked open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the warm glow of an indoor lamp. It was a woman, small-framed, her shoulders hunched, her posture radiating an almost palpable fear. Her hair, once likely vibrant, was streaked with gray, and her eyes, even from a distance, seemed haunted. This was Dr. Evelyn Reed, the anonymous sender, the frightened former government scientist. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a strained whisper, barely audible above the rising wind. "You actually came," she said. Not as a question, but as a statement of profound surprise, almost relief. Eris stepped inside, the cabin a stark contrast to the wild expanse outside. It was small, sparsely furnished, but meticulously clean, bearing the hallmarks of someone living in self-imposed exile. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood smoke and old paper. Evelyn gestured to a worn wooden table, her movements jerky, as if constantly on guard. She looked even more fragile up close, her face etched with exhaustion and a deep-seated terror that seemed to have become a permanent resident. "I'm Dr. Eris Thorne," he began, extending a hand, but she recoiled slightly. Not out of rudeness, but an ingrained caution. She simply nodded, her gaze darting to the windows, then back to him. "I know who you are, Dr. Thorne. I've followed your work for years. Your theories. They were the only ones bold enough, open enough, to even consider what I found." Her voice was tight, thin, laden with unshed tears. She explained, in fragmented sentences, how she had been part of a clandestine government research project decades ago, studying anomalous biological samples from remote regions. How she stumbled upon something that broke every rule of established science, something that those in power had deemed too dangerous, too destabilizing to ever see the light of day. They had tried to silence her, to discredit her, to make her disappear. She had been in hiding ever since, living off the grid, haunted by her discovery. Then, with a sudden, almost desperate resolve, she reached under the table, pulling out a small, velvet-lined wooden box. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a single, perfectly preserved bone fragment. It was unlike anything Aris had ever seen. Larger than any primate bone of its type, yet undeniably hominid in its basic structure. It possessed an incredible density and a subtle, almost imperceptible curvature that defied known anatomical blueprints. The cortical bone was thicker, the texture subtly different, hinting at immense strength. Then it was no ordinary fossil. It was too robust, too distinct. Aris's breath hitched in his throat. He reached out, his scientific instincts overriding his lingering apprehension. His fingers grazed the cool, smooth surface of the bone. It was real, tangible. The photographs, the cryptic messages, the paranoia, the long, arduous journey. It all converged in this one small, undeniable piece of evidence. His skepticism, once his greatest strength, now crumbled into dust, replaced by an electrifying surge of scientific passion. This fragment was a Rosetta Stone, a key to an entirely new chapter in the story of life on Earth, a story far more complex and terrifying than any he had ever imagined. The cold dread that had accompanied him on his journey was not gone, but it had transformed, evolving into a potent cocktail of fear and exhilarating, almost dangerous curiosity. He looked up at Evelyn, her eyes wide, with a mixture of terror and nascent hope. "Tell me everything," he urged, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on the fragment that promised to shatter worlds. Evelyn's eyes, still haunted by years of solitary fear, seemed to hold a flicker of relief as Aris's words echoed in the small cabin. She nodded slowly, a profound weariness etched onto her face, yet a newfound determination seemed to stiffen her spine. "There's more, Dr. Thorne. Far more. This is just a piece of the puzzle. The true discovery, the one that broke me and forced me into this life, is out there, not far from here." Her voice dropped to a near whisper, laden with a mix of dread and urgent necessity. "But you must understand, what we uncover isn't just a new species. It's a paradigm shift, a revelation that will redefine everything humanity believes about its own origins." Without another word, she rose, retrieved a worn rucksack from a corner, and gestured for him to follow. The air outside was crisp, the forest now bathed in the ethereal glow of pre-dawn light. They walked for what felt like hours, deeper into the ancient woods, the path growing increasingly faint, swallowed by thick undergrowth and gnarled roots. Aris, a seasoned field researcher, noted Evelyn's uncanny ability to navigate the tangled wilderness, her steps sure and silent, as if she herself were a creature of the forest. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of their boots on fallen leaves and the distant call of an unknown bird. He felt himself shedding the last vestiges of academic detachment, replaced by an almost primal sense of anticipation. Finally, after traversing a steep, hidden ravine, they arrived at what appeared to be a natural rock formation, almost entirely concealed by dense moss and hanging vines. Evelyn pushed aside a curtain of ivy, revealing a narrow crevice in the rock face, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "This is it," she breathed, her voice tight with emotion. "The entrance." Aris followed her into the cool, damp darkness of the cave. The air grew heavy, carrying a faint, earthy smell mixed with something else. something ancient and subtly metallic. Evelyn produced a powerful LED lantern, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating a vast, cathedral-like chamber within the earth. Eris's breath caught in his throat. Stretched across the cave floor, meticulously excavated and largely intact, lay the skeletal remains of a creature that defied description. It was enormous, easily twice the size of a modern human, with powerful, thick-boned limbs and a massive ribcage. The skull, though fragmented in places, hinted at a robust cranial capacity, yet retained distinctly archaic features. This was no bear, no gorilla, no known hominin. This was something else entirely. A gigantic, upright hominid, unequivocally. Eris stumbled forward, his scientific mind racing, trying to reconcile this impossible reality with everything he thought he knew. He knelt beside the skeletal structure, his hands trembling as he gently examined the bone. The sheer scale and robustness were staggering. The femur alone was longer and thicker than his entire forearm, indicative of immense strength and bipedal locomotion over vast distances. He noted the distinctive sagittal crest, a bony ridge along the top of the skull for powerful jaw muscle attachment, far more pronounced than in any human ancestor. The articulation of the joints, the curvature of the spine, everything pointed towards a creature of formidable power, and an evolutionary path diverging significantly from the human lineage. He pulled out his portable field kit, quickly setting up his specialized tools. He meticulously collected soil samples from around the bones for stratigraphic dating, took close-up photographs of key anatomical features, and used a handheld spectrometer to perform an initial elemental analysis of the bone material. The spectrometer's readings were consistent with organic material, undeniably bone, but its trace element composition hinted at an extreme antiquity, far beyond merely thousands, perhaps even millions of years. It was in situ, undisturbed for an unfathomable amount of time. The bone density was extraordinary, confirming the initial observation from the fragment Evelyn had shown him. This was not a hoax, not a misidentification. It was a physical, undeniable reality. As he worked, Evelyn watched him, her fears slowly giving way to a hopeful reverence. "I found it almost 40 years ago," she whispered, her voice echoing faintly in the cavern. "I tried to tell them. The project leaders. They locked me out, threatened my career, my life." Eris continued his detailed on-site analysis, feeling a surge of exhilaration mixed with profound awe. He focused on the pelvic structure, noting its broad, basin-like shape, clearly adapted for bipedalism, but significantly wider and more robust than any Australopithecine or early Homo species. He ran his gloved hand along the massive humerus, feeling the extreme muscle attachment points. Then he moved to the skull, piecing together the fragmented maxilla and mandible. The teeth were large, heavily worn, molars particularly massive, suggesting a diet requiring significant chewing power. But it was the subtle interplay of features, the morphology of the cranium combined with the postcranial skeleton, that began to paint a truly disturbing picture. He ran a comparative analysis in his mind, drawing on decades of study of hominin evolution. The brow ridge, while prominent, had a slightly different angle, a more pronounced supraorbital torus than even Homo erectus. The foramen magnum, where the spinal cord enters the skull, was positioned perfectly for an upright posture, yet the neutral crests, for neck muscle attachment, were incredibly developed, hinting at a head much heavier than a human's, requiring powerful support. The shocking implication began to coalesce, piecing itself together in his mind like a grim mosaic. While superficially humanoid, the skeletal structure screamed of an evolutionary path, tailored for immense physical dominance and survival in harsh, unforgiving environments. It was not merely a large primate. It was a highly specialized bipedal predator or omnivore, perfectly adapted to its niche. But the most unsettling realization struck him not from its differences, but from its terrifying similarities. There were echoes of early human morphology, hints of shared ancestry, but warped, exaggerated, pushed to an extreme. This creature wasn't just a parallel evolution. There were features that suggested an interwoven, perhaps even competitive, lineage with early Homo. A branch of the hominin tree that had grown monstrously strong, profoundly ancient, and disturbingly persistent. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cave's cold. This wasn't just a new species. It felt like a missing, terrifying chapter in humanity's own story, one that had been deliberately or accidentally erased. He looked up at Evelyn, his face a mask of profound realization and burgeoning horror. "Evelyn," he breathed, his voice hoarse, "this isn't just a Bigfoot. This is a ghost from our own evolutionary past. A species that somehow endured, and its existence changes everything we understand about who we are." The weight of the world, of all scientific understanding, seemed to press down on them both in that silent, ancient cavern. "Tell me everything," Eris had urged, his voice heavy with a profound mix of scientific hunger and burgeoning dread. Evelyn, still trembling, began to detail the location of the main excavation site she had managed to conceal for so long. She described a hidden cave nestled deep within a forgotten section of the vast national forest, accessible only by a treacherous, overgrown path she had painstakingly cleared over months. The fragment she held, she explained, was merely a small piece of a much larger puzzle, an appetizer for the unimaginable feast of scientific discovery awaiting them. Her story, delivered in hushed, urgent tones, painted a picture of a clandestine operation, a government project that sought to control, rather than understand, the anomalous. The journey to the cave was even more arduous than Eris had anticipated. Evelyn, despite her frail appearance, navigated the dense undergrowth with a practiced stealth, her senses acutely tuned to every rustle and snap of twig. They moved in silence, a palpable tension hanging between them, each aware they were venturing into forbidden territory, both literally and figuratively. When they finally reached the hidden entrance, cleverly disguised by overgrown vines and a cleverly stacked rockfall, Eris felt a jolt of primal awe. The air immediately grew colder, carrying with it the damp, earthy scent of ancient rock and time itself. Inside, Evelyn carefully illuminated the cavern with a powerful specialized lantern. What Eris saw next stole his breath and made his heart pound with a terrifying rhythm. There, laid out on the dusty cave floor, was the complete, articulated skeleton of a hominid unlike any documented in scientific history. It dwarfed every known human ancestor, its bones thick and robust, suggesting immense power and stature. The skull was massive, with a prominent brow ridge and an almost sagittal crest. Yet the facial structure retained an eerily familiar, almost human quality. It was a giant, an impossible being, perfectly preserved in the cool, stable environment of the cave. Eris, a paleoanthropologist who had dedicated his life to understanding human origins, felt his entire worldview teetering on the precipice of collapse. He dropped to his knees, utterly mesmerized, his trained eyes scanning every curve, every joint, every minute detail. He saw the hallmarks of bipedalism, powerful leg bones, and broad pelvic structure, all scaled up to an unimaginable degree. This creature, whatever it was, walked upright, dominated its environment, and possessed a physical form that made even the most robust Neanderthal seem delicate by comparison. Evelyn watched him, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by the vindication she saw burning in his eyes. They spent days in that cave, working with a frantic energy fueled by espresso and stale trail mix. Eris, meticulous in his approach, photographed every angle, measured every bone, and took countless samples. The initial analysis confirmed the organic nature of the remains. This was no elaborate hoax. The bones were fossilized, but not petrified, suggesting an age that comfortably pushed beyond any known large primate or hominid species for this region. The implications were staggering. This creature existed, and it existed here, in North America, at a time when canonical evolutionary timelines suggested only early humans were migrating across continents, leaving no room for such an advanced, divergent species. As they meticulously brushed away millenniums of dust and sediment, Evelyn pointed to subtle, almost imperceptible etchings on certain bone surfaces. They weren't accidental, but deliberate markings, almost ritualistic patterns that hinted at a rudimentary culture. And then, nestled near the pelvic region, they discovered crude stone tools, scrapers, choppers, and flakes, unlike any Eris had ever cataloged. They were simple, yet effective, crafted from local obsidian and chert, bearing a unique typology. These weren't human tools, but tools nonetheless, suggesting intelligence and purposeful action. The discovery of the tools, combined with the sheer scale of the skeleton, sent a chilling shiver down Eris's spine. His mind, trained to connect disparate pieces of archaeological and anthropological data, began to forge a terrifying link. He remembered the countless indigenous legends his colleagues often dismissed as mere folklore. The stories of giant, hairy forest people, shy yet powerful, sometimes benevolent, sometimes terrifyingly aggressive. The Sasquatch, the Bigfoot, the Wendigo, all sharing common threads of immense strength, profound connection to the wild, and an elusive nature. These bones, these tools, they weren't just evidence of a new species. They were the physical manifestation of those whispered legends, breathing life into ancient fears. But the most disturbing truth began to emerge from the cranial structure and the dental records. The massive molars, the distinct wear patterns, and the powerful jaw musculature indicated an omnivorous diet, capable of processing both tough plant matter and raw meat with equal efficiency. The cranial capacity, while large, suggested a different cognitive architecture than Homo sapiens, perhaps optimized for sensory perception, pattern recognition, and survival in extreme environments rather than abstract thought and complex language. And then there were the subtle, yet unmistakable, signs of predation, not just as a hunter, but as a formidable presence in the food chain. Deep gouges on a femur suggested a violent struggle, the kind made by a powerful, sharp-clawed adversary, but the surrounding bone showed signs of healing, indicating the creature had survived. Conversely, tiny splintered fragments of other bones, distinctly mammalian but not hominid, were found embedded in the creature's ribcage, suggesting it had been the victor in countless brutal encounters. This was not a passive forest dweller. This was an apex predator, a force of nature, perfectly adapted and incredibly resilient. Its very existence shattered the comforting narrative of human exceptionalism and solitary dominion. The thought of such a creature, so powerful, so ancient, yet so unknown, lurking in the shadows of human history, brought a cold, suffocating dread. It wasn't just a new species. It was a ghost from our shared past, a terrifying truth lying dormant, waiting to be unearthed. The makeshift lab pulsed with the low hum of machinery, a stark contrast to the wilderness outside. Eris and Evelyn worked in a synchronized dance of meticulous observation and furious analysis, the air thick with the scent of solvents and the nervous energy of groundbreaking discovery. They had managed to transport some of the most critical bone fragments from the hidden cave, along with soil samples and a few of the enigmatic artifacts, to a secluded, well-equipped cabin that Evelyn had maintained as a safe house for years. This cabin, tucked even deeper into the remote American forest, had been meticulously prepared for such a contingency, a testament to Evelyn's foresight and the enduring threat she had lived under. Using portable spectrometers, mass spectrometers, and even a rudimentary genetic sequencing kit Evelyn had painstakingly assembled over the years from surplus government equipment, they delved into the secrets held within the ancient bones. The initial carbon dating results, cross-referenced with geological strata from the excavation site, consistently pointed to an astonishing age, over 300,000 years old. This alone pushed the boundaries of known hominin habitation in North America, challenging every established archaeological timeline. But the dating was only the beginning. As the genetic data slowly coalesced on their screens, a pattern emerged that sent shivers down Eris's spine. The mitochondrial DNA showed a distinct haplogroup, unlike anything recorded in human or known primate genomes. It was archaic, yet undeniably hominid. The nuclear DNA, even more complex and fragmented, provided the shattering revelation. This Sasquatch species was not merely a distant cousin, a primitive offshoot that died out without consequence. Instead, the genetic markers revealed a startling divergence point from the human lineage that was much closer than expected, far more intertwined. It was as if two distinct branches had bloomed from the same proto-hominid stalk, one leading to Homo sapiens, and the other to this formidable, unknown species. The key lay in the subtle, yet critical, differences in gene expression related to muscular development, bone density, and even specific neurological pathways. These genetic nuances painted a vivid picture of a creature designed for immense physical power and heightened sensory perception, a perfect apex predator in its environment. The implications were devastating for Eris. His entire academic career, built on the elegant, linear narrative of human evolution, a steady progression from early hominids to our intellectually dominant species, crumbled before his eyes. He had always envisioned humanity's ascent as a triumphant march, driven by intelligence and cooperation, a species that gradually overcame the challenges of the natural world through ingenuity. Now, staring at the glowing data, he saw a darker, more violent narrative. The genetic evidence suggested intense, prolonged competition. This species, with its superior strength and adaptation to harsh environments, wasn't just coexisting with early humans. It was likely vying for the same resources, occupying similar ecological niches. The thought twisted his gut. Were early humans, then, not simply evolving in isolation, but in constant, brutal conflict with a genetically similar, incredibly powerful foe? Had our intelligence, our capacity for complex communication and tool-making, been honed not just by environmental pressures, but by the relentless evolutionary pushback from this formidable competitor? The idea that human development, perhaps even survival, was predicated on outwitting, outmaneuvering, and ultimately overcoming a species so closely related yet terrifyingly superior physically was an intellectual body blow. It replaced the romanticized view of early hominids as benign hunter-gatherers, evolving peacefully with a grittier, bloodier reality. The myths of Bigfoot, the legends of wild men of the woods, suddenly took on a terrifying new dimension. They weren't just campfire stories. They were echoes of an ancient interspecies conflict, etched into the collective unconscious of humanity. Eris felt a profound sense of loss, as if the very foundation of his understanding of humanity had been yanked out from under him. The peaceful, linear ascent of Homo sapiens was a comforting illusion. The truth, as revealed by the cold, hard data, was a saga of struggle, adaptation, and perhaps even genocidal conflict. It hinted at a history where our ancestors, far from being the unchallenged masters of their destiny, were instead locked in a desperate, protracted battle for survival against a species that was, in many ways, their evolutionary mirror image, albeit a more physically dominant one. It was a truth that shattered him, leaving him adrift in a sea of unsettling possibilities about mankind's true origins and the violent crucible that forged us. He looked at Evelyn, her face grim, mirroring his own profound unease. The data was irrefutable, and its message was clear. Humanity's story was far from what we'd been taught. The weight of this new, brutal history pressed down on Eris and Evelyn. The initial shock gave way to a chilling determination. They had to get this information out, to puncture the comfortable facade of human exceptionalism and reveal the true, violent crucible of our origins. As they continued to refine their data, meticulously cross-referencing genetic markers and anatomical models, a new, unsettling element began to creep into their isolated existence. Subtle at first, then increasingly overt, signs of surveillance started to manifest around their makeshift lab. A broken branch on the seldom-used trail leading to their cabin snapped in a way that wasn't natural. A glint of reflected light from a distant ridge, too regular, too metallic to be sunlight on rock. The faint, almost imperceptible hum of a drone, lingering high above the tree line just out of sight. They were scientists, accustomed to observation, but this was different. This felt predatory. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the dense forest outside, became imbued with a sinister potential. Their once secure sanctuary now felt profoundly exposed, a glass house under an unseen gaze. Evelyn, with her background as a former government scientist, was the first to recognize the hallmarks. "They're watching us," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the fear that gnawed at Eris. "The same patterns, the same precision. It's not some random hunter or curious hiker." Her eyes, usually analytical, now held a deep-seated apprehension. "I've seen this before. They want to know what we know, and then they'll make sure we can't tell anyone." Eris, still grappling with the philosophical earthquake of their discovery, found himself abruptly thrust into a world of espionage and paranoia. He'd always prided himself on intellectual rigor, not evasion tactics, but the stakes were too high to ignore Evelyn's warnings. They began to implement rudimentary counter-surveillance measures, simple ones at first, checking for tripwires, observing natural patterns, noting irregularities. Each observation confirmed Evelyn's chilling assessment. They were indeed being hunted. Through Evelyn's fragmented memories and veiled illusions, a picture began to form of a shadowy organization, one that operated with chilling efficiency and an almost limitless reach. She spoke of whispers in secure government facilities, of classified projects buried deep within bureaucratic labyrinths, all revolving around anomalous hominid sightings and unexplained paleoanthropological discrepancies. This wasn't a sudden, reactive interest in their current findings. This was a well-established, decades-long operation to suppress any shred of evidence that deviated from the officially sanctioned narrative of human origins. "They've been doing this for generations, Eris," Evelyn explained. her fingers tracing an invisible map on the dusty lab table. Any discovery that hints at alternative evolutionary paths, any physical evidence of something other existing alongside or before us, it gets buried, discredited. Sometimes the people who find it disappear. She wouldn't elaborate further on the disappearances, but the unspoken implication hung heavy in the air, a cold dread seeping into Aris's bones. This wasn't merely academic censorship. This was a deliberate, ruthless effort to control the very definition of humanity. They realized then that their isolation, once a protective measure against academic scrutiny, had become a trap. They were vulnerable, their data a ticking time bomb, and the walls were closing in. They couldn't simply publish their findings through traditional channels. The moment they tried, they would be intercepted, their research confiscated, their reputations systematically dismantled. They had to go bigger, bolder. They had to bypass the gatekeepers entirely. A desperate plan began to form, born of necessity and a grim understanding of their predicament. They would leak their findings, not just to a scientific journal, but to the world. They would use the very anonymity of the internet, the global reach of information, as their shield. Public knowledge, they reasoned, was their only defense. If enough people knew, if the truth was disseminated widely enough, it would be impossible for the shadowy organization to put the genie back in the bottle. They couldn't disappear an entire global consciousness. Their days became a frantic blur of refining their data, preparing comprehensive reports, compiling irrefutable evidence. They encrypted everything, creating multiple redundant copies, seeding them across secure networks, laying the groundwork for a simultaneous, unstoppable release. Aris, the academic, became a master of digital subterfuge, guided by Evelyn's quiet expertise in operational security. They worked relentlessly, fueled by instant coffee and a burning conviction that the truth, however unsettling, deserved to be known. "We have to make it undeniable," Aris insisted, reviewing a meticulously crafted diagram of cranial sutures that diverged sharply from Homo sapiens. Every piece of data must scream authenticity. No room for doubt, no opportunity for them to dismiss it as a hoax. Evelyn nodded, her focus absolute as she coded a script that would bypass firewalls and blast their findings into the public domain through an intricate web of anonymous servers and encrypted relays. The tension was palpable, a constant thrum beneath their skin. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant sound a harbinger of discovery. They knew the moment they initiated the leak, they would trigger a response far more aggressive than mere surveillance. They would become explicit targets. But for Aris, the intellectual crisis he had endured had forged a steel resolve. The truth about humanity's violent origins, the long-suppressed story of our struggle against a formidable, forgotten relative, was too important to remain buried. The weight of human history, his history, demanded it. They were ready to ignite the biggest scientific scandal the world had ever seen, and they knew, with chilling certainty, that the fight for truth would be far from over once the data went live. The critical moment arrived, a tense ballet of keystrokes and encrypted uploads. Thorne and Reed, fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and sheer intellectual desperation, sat side by side in their makeshift lab, the glow of their monitors illuminating their determined faces. Outside, the night pressed in, thick with the silence of the wilderness and the unseen eyes of their pursuers. Evelyn, ever the pragmatist, had meticulously prepared a multi-pronged release strategy, ensuring that even if one channel was compromised, others would succeed. Files, encrypted and compressed, zipped across the digital ether, targeting a network of independent journalists, whistleblower platforms, in scientific forums that had pledged anonymity and wide distribution. They used a series of anonymous proxies, bouncing their signal through a labyrinth of international servers, a digital ghost dance designed to evade the sophisticated tracking capabilities they knew their adversaries possessed. Each successful upload was met with a shared silent breath, a small victory against overwhelming odds. Suddenly, the cabin's lights flickered violently, plunging them into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. A faint, low hum resonated from the forest, growing steadily louder. "They're here," Evelyn whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm she kept hidden beneath the table. A relic from her days in government research, a grim testament to the paranoia that had become her constant companion. Thorne, his heart pounding, ignored the growing threat outside, his focus entirely on the progress bars inching across the screens. This wasn't merely about personal survival. It was about the survival of truth, about ripping away the comfortable lies humanity had built around its origins. The hum intensified, evolving into the distinct thrum of rotor blades, drawing closer. A faint, flashing light pulsed through the trees. With a final, triumphant ping from the main server, Evelyn slammed her hand down on the enter key for the last, crucial upload. "It's done," she declared, a tremor in her voice that was half relief, half terror. "All channels live." Almost immediately, the cabin door splintered inward with a deafening crash. Shadows flooded the room as armed figures, clad in tactical gear and moving with chilling precision, poured in. They were too late. Thorne and Reed stood, hands raised, the cold barrels of high-tech weaponry pointed at them. But a defiant glint resided in Thorne's eyes. The secret was out. Within hours, the world began to reel. News agencies, initially skeptical, were forced to confront the avalanche of irrefutable data, high-resolution scans, genetic sequences, and even compelling video footage of the excavation site that had been leaked. The sheer volume and scientific rigor of the evidence were impossible to dismiss. Headlines screamed of the Sasquatch genome, humanity's lost cousin, and evolutionary betrayal. Leading paleoanthropologists and geneticists, initially hesitant, soon confirmed the veracity of the findings, their own careers and reputations now staked on unraveling this staggering new chapter in human history. The scientific community was in an uproar, a mixture of exhilaration and profound intellectual shock. Eris Thorne, though now under intense scrutiny and facing potential legal battles for the unauthorized release of classified information, found a new, ferocious purpose. He became the reluctant spokesperson for this inconvenient truth, tirelessly defending the findings, explaining the complex genetic and anatomical implications to a stunned public. His old paradigm was shattered, but from its ruins rose a stronger, more courageous version of himself. He no longer sought accolades for confirming established theories. His mission became the unwavering defense of a reality that defied every comfortable assumption. Evelyn, largely remaining in the shadows, provided strategic support, using her intimate knowledge of the clandestine world to navigate the political and corporate minefields that quickly emerged. The global conversation exploded. Religious groups grappled with theological implications. Historians were forced to re-examine ancient myths and legends through an entirely new lens. Anthropologists spoke of a before and after in the study of human origins. The notion of a shared ancestry with a physically dominant, aggressive hominid forced humanity to confront a darker, more competitive aspect of its evolutionary past. It wasn't just about discovering a new species. It was about fundamentally altering humanity's self-perception, its place in the natural world. The romanticized image of early hominids as benign, curious explorers was replaced by one of tenacious survivors, constantly battling for supremacy against a formidable, closely related foe. This struggle, it was argued, had likely forged the very traits that defined humanity: intelligence, cunning, cooperation, and tool-making, all honed in a crucible of interspecies conflict. One quiet evening, months after the initial storm, Thorne stood on the porch of his secluded cabin, the same cabin where he and Evelyn had made their desperate stand. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The vast wilderness stretched before him, silent and inscrutable. He understood now that comfort was often a barrier to understanding, and that truth, however unsettling, was the only path to genuine knowledge. The discovery hadn't just revealed a lost branch on the evolutionary tree. It had revealed a foundational, brutal truth about human existence, reminding everyone that our origins were far more complex and mysterious than we had ever dared to imagine. As the first stars began to prick the deepening twilight, Eris Thorne, forever changed, knew that some truths were simply too profound, too essential, to remain hidden, no matter the cost. His work was just beginning, the long process of integrating this unsettling reality into the fabric of human understanding. The wilderness, he realized, still held countless secrets, waiting for those brave enough to look.